Good afternoon. I'm here for a weekend end notes, a Monday weekend end notes. I'm over my late lunch break, actually, here right now. And in broadest terms, I had an excellent, a near perfect weekend. I laid around, I watched golf, and I read, and did nothing else, really. But it was only near perfect because whatever came over me last weekend just wouldn't go away. It wouldn't totally abate. I was a little tired. My chest was still bothering, my throat and my head were still bothering me. So as a result, I didn't go into the gym. On a rare occasion here, I listened to my body and didn't go into the gym. Now, I can miss a day or two at the gym and I'll be okay. I'll feel off. Things won't feel quite right, but I'll be okay. When you get to 4 days, I get pretty close to going postal. So today, now that I'm feeling much better, I need to go to the gym. And I think it should be just fine. The only thing that's left is a slight soreness in the throat. Not even soreness, it just weakness in the voice that causes it to get scratchy after I talk a lot. We'll see if I do or don't talk a lot here. My last few videos have been way too long, and I need to pull in a little bit, I think. I had a meeting this morning, actually, and when it started, I was fine. I was talking during the meeting. Then by the end, I could feel and hear, rather, the scratchiness coming back. So it is possible that it could happen here, and I apologize in advance. I will probably be frustrated going to the gym today. For those of you who do work out regularly, as you know, getting sick can just decimate your gains. I'm not overly worried about it because my body and my muscles have more or less felt fine throughout this whole thing. It's just been in the throat, the chest, and the head. So I don't think it's going to be the worst thing in the world. But I know it will be an aggravating step back because I haven't been sick for a while. I've been extremely consistent at the gym, and I've been making fantastic gains over a long period of time to the point where over the last month, they were coming very slowly. It was not weekly gains anymore. And I'd actually been considering deloading. So when things are moving that incrementally, it's just inevitable that something like this is going to disrupt it all a little more than usual. I mean, at that point, an incomplete night of sleep is going to give you problems. So I just know I'm going to have some frustration at the gym. And I think I am going to ultimately take this as a chance to deload and take another run at things. It'll just be a natural break, I guess. Maybe I'll report back. But beyond that, yeah, the weekend was great. On Saturday, I woke up and I read all morning, and that what was it? It was at 11. At 11, I went over and watched golf with a few guys. We made pimento cheese sandwiches, which is a sandwich at the Masters, a famous sandwich, and we made azalea cocktails, which is the cocktail at the Masters. Probably didn't help my recovery, but I didn't get that aggressive with them. I got home at a good time. I had plenty of sleep last night, or the night before, and they're delicious, so I regret nothing. But it was just fun watching golf, talking golf with some people. The only drawback was I didn't get as much reading done as I otherwise would have. But I was able to make up some of that time yesterday. I woke up, and I really only left my bed to shower, make breakfast, and make coffee, too. Otherwise, I laid around and I read all morning into the afternoon. It was so glorious. And I didn't turn on golf until the leaders teed off at 1:30 or whatever it was. And once they had teed off, I was only following Bryson DeChambeau and Rory, and then also Justin Rose's group. So between their shots, I even muted the golf and would get a few more pages in. So I was reading while the tournament was on. And when it was over, I watched some commentary, the No Lane Up podcast, obviously, and finally read for the rest of the night and was probably up a little bit later than I should have been. Uh, and it was great to see Rory win the Masters, of course it was. It's been 14 years coming. I can only imagine the relief he felt. And honestly, he's probably the most normal, most down to earth, most likable professional athlete that I can think of. So I was very pleased to see him win and was rooting for him the whole time, even though he put my heart through its paces. I'll also confess, though, that I was rooting a little bit for Justin Rose. I'm not a Justin Rose super fan, who is, but whenever some of the old timers, I think he's around 45, but by professional athlete standards, he's up there. But whenever some of the old timers compete in these big tournaments, I can't help but root for them a little bit. It's like they're saying, I can't do this week in and week out, but I still have a little magic left. I still have a little skill left, and let me show you. I love that, and so I, I wouldn't have been completely crushed if Rose has won. Rose had won, but I certainly wasn't disappointed with the outcome. Uh, so I should probably cap the golf talk there. I think my new strategy on BookTube is I open my videos by either boring the crap out of you or by insulting someone, and it seems to be going okay so far. So I wonder if I'll keep it up. Now, in terms of the books that I've finished since my last Weekend-endnotes, the first one here that I'm going to talk about is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy by Jonathan Rauch. Now, Jonathan Rauch is a writer at The Atlantic, and I'm a big fan of his. His last book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is excellent. I think he's better known for The Kindly Inquisitors, or at least that's the book that made his name, I guess. And I would encourage you to read those. But also one thing I want to mention is back in the early 2000s, this is a bit of a side note, but back in the early 2000s, he was one of the few writers on the right writing in favor of gay marriage. Now, he himself is gay, but there were only a few of them, and I hope that does remain part of his legacy. I think we all think of Andrew Sullivan. He's conservative, Catholic, and gay, and his reputation there is fully deserved. I don't want to take anything away from him. I think you could even argue he's certainly one of the most important journalists of the last 25 years, but I just don't want us to forget that Rauch was right there too. He isn't conservative in the way Sullivan is. He's more small L liberal, but nonetheless an important voice on the right. Anyway, today's book, though, is certainly, the one that I disagree with the most that he's written. There's plenty of good in it. For example, criticisms of post-liberal conservatism, identification of issues within Christianity. A lot of that is excellent, but the big points of the book are hooey, to use a scientific and technical term. I think Rauch is a deeply intelligent and sensitive writer, and everything I like about him and his writing is in here, but it's deeply intelligent hooey. And we just have to confront that. Now, he kicks off this book, well, he kicks it off with a letter to a friend, but once that's aside, he kicks it off by talking about a 2003 Atlantic article. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the name of it, but I'll link to it below. And in that article, he gives us a term called apatheism, which is just not caring very much one way or the other about religion. And so think about it in connection with the rise of the nuns, okay? And he predicted that this apatheism was the product of a determined cultural effort to discipline the religious mindset, and often an equally determined personal effort to master the spiritual passions. It's not a lapse, it's an achievement, he writes. Now, in this book, he says, look, that's the dumbest thing I've ever written. Extreme words, especially for a phenomenon that's so obvious. Okay, so why is it the dumbest thing that he's ever written, according to him? Well, he says, look at our politics. Since I wrote this, have things gotten better or have they gotten worse? Well, they've gotten worse, obviously. More specifically, he says that since he wrote that, our religious appetite has been imported into our politics, and our politics has been exported into our religion, and this has intensified polarization. I paraphrase that, but it's near exact wording to what he wrote. And he very much leans on that import-export language, that balance of trade type language. And as I'll quote him in a minute, he says right now there's a cultural deficit in the balance of trade between religion and liberalism. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at the premise or context of the book, and then also the main thesis of the book. The premise is that secular liberalism and religion are both incomplete worldviews, and they exist in separate spheres. Being in different spheres, they're both made or best positioned, I guess, but I think probably made to answer certain questions. And their ability to answer those questions, their unique and distinct ability to answer those questions, means they give us publicly different, certain, and important benefits. Secular liberalism, on the one hand, gives us procedural virtues, and religion, on the other, gives us civic virtues. Okay, and so I'm going to quote him here, if you'll pardon me. My claim is not just that secular liberalism and religious faith are instrumentally interdependent, but that each is intrinsically reliant on the other to build a morally and epistemically complete and coherent account of the world. In other words, the structure of the moral and epistemic universes is such that both ways of thought are incomplete, even in principle, although they are always in tension and sometimes in outright conflict. Neither by itself will neither by itself will ever be able to satisfy human needs to cope with the world. And that word satisfy is extremely important because he's an atheist, and so he doesn't think that religion actually answers those certain questions. I'm not specifying them right now. I don't want to get quite that granular, but he does in the book. So excuse me. But he doesn't think religion actually answers those questions. However, most people think that it can answer those questions, and they find those answers satisfying. And that's really what matters, and that's why it's necessary. So now going on from that context to the thesis of the book, he says Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our democracy. The substance of Christianity is important for democracy, its actual content. However, it's been failing in this bargain it has with democracy, right, with the civic virtues and the procedural virtues. And it's in a trade deficit, like I said. So he says the church is a net importer of values from the secular world, and when that happens, it becomes morally derivative instead of morally formative. Rather than shaping secular values, it merely reflects them and thus melts into the society. And he calls this thin Christianity, okay? So that's the big picture of the book. I don't really agree with a word of that. I think you could separate it into sort of a philosophical or theoretical part and then an empirical observational part, but neither works. So he says religion can only answer these questions, right? So why does your life have meaning? But what he doesn't seem to appreciate in the book is that those are also religious questions. Okay, so we don't mean, when people say this, they don't mean meaning as in why does something have value, right? Why does life have value? That's an easy question to answer. It's because you're going to be dead. It's temporary, okay? When people say religion gives life meaning, when they say meaning, they're using it as a religious concept. And I think that's true of the other questions he deals with. And it didn't seem to me that he fully appreciated that. And then in terms of the other components, I think there's a little bit of misidentification going on there, especially in terms of, what's causing our political problems. Now, in one way, it's anodyne. If he's just saying an important part of society is Christian, an important part of the voting public is Christian, and so it's better for us to have a healthy Christianity than to have an unhealthy one. Well, yeah, but who's going to disagree with that? So to the extent he's saying that, I agree with him, and he does say that, but he goes too far beyond that, in my view. And then also, now that I'm talking out loud, another thing I think he completely missed was that with this rise of the nuns and people becoming less religious, a huge number of those are breaking away from a religion that they were indoctrinated in. I don't think that a huge amount, most, if not all of what he says about the Christianity being a load-bearing wall would be true, or the need to have these religious questions answered would be true if people just weren't indoctrinated into religion, and he doesn't say anything about that. So those are at least some of my high-level thoughts. I will say this was the only book that I read recently where I wanted to go back and reread it again. It's still Jonathan Rauch, so it's still smart. It's still sensitive for the third time I'm saying that. And my favorite part of the book, or parts of the book, were that beginning and ending, where he writes a letter to a friend who, in the second letter, we find out is dead. And while I was reading the book, I got the impression that it was born out of having this friend in mind and also having conversations with other religious friends. I got the impression that Jonathan Rauch is probably a very good friend. However, in these conversations, I think he may be ceding too much ground to these religious friends or giving them too much deference or accepting too many of their arguments. Again, those questions that he's saying only religion can answer, secularism isn't able to, those are religious questions in the way that those are using those terms, and I don't know why he doesn't get that. Either way, I was watching interviews afterward, and it did confirm that a huge amount of this is born out of conversations, weekly conversations he has with friends who are religious. But in terms of that letter to his friend Mark, it was really just the sweetest thing in the world on both sides, very touching. And he opens, it doesn't open, but in that opening letter, he writes, "I was prepared to confront Christianity, but I was not prepared for you. Within the first couple of weeks, I realized you were different. You did not proselytize, but shone by example, exhibiting gentleness and courtesy to all you met." And that's lovely. They met, by the way, in college. They roomed together, I think, and that's what he's referring to here. But both letters are really like that, and so I'll go back at the very least and reread them. I thought they were very, very nice. Okay, that's enough on that book. Let's press on to the next one I read. And that is Abundance by Ezra Klein, who's at the New York Times, and then Derek Thompson, who's overrated, first of all, but he's at The Atlantic, like Jonathan Rauch. And this book is written by two progressives talking in-house. So they're trying to have a conversation with other, capital L, liberals within the country. And it argues that rules, bureaucracy, and regulations of the last decade and our current politics are both existing systems and politics of scarcity. I hope that wasn't too clumsy of me in phrasing it. And so people on the left, what they've been focusing too much on when it comes to confronting problems is the demand side, and they need to focus more on the supply side. We see an issue with healthcare, subsidize it, subsidize the demand side. You see an issue with the environment, subsidize the demand side. Okay, they're saying we need to think more supply side in terms of production, but then also over the last decades, liberals haven't fully appreciated how harmful bureaucracy has become. Conservatives are knee-jerk, critics of government, whereas liberals are knee-jerk in their defense and their advocacy for it, right? And that's why he thinks this is important to note. But in more detail, and where it's more interesting, is when he gives examples of the introduction of regulations, rules, and again bureaucracy in the attempt to stop, for example, the building of environmentally harmful infrastructure. But then he says, at this point, those well-intended rules, regulations, and bureaucracies are actually now preventing our building of green infrastructure, and we need to rethink that too. So you can see how it's very much a conversation with people on the left. In fact, they write toward the end of the book, "This book has offered a critique of the ways liberals have governed and thought over the past 50 years. It also reflects on an opportunity open to liberals now, meaning seeing how the right has turned toward populism," that's their term, and a scarcity agenda. They didn't have to do that. So the right has leaned into anti-immigration tariffs, but they could have leaned into, say, the housing policy in Texas, which is YIMBY, to use that term. But now, because they're doing that, the left has a chance to take on the productivity and the supply side mantle and agenda. And those are, I guess those are the big points that I'll make here. As a reading experience, I think it's pretty dull. I would have finished it in one sitting. A sitting is like 220 some pages before you get to the endnotes and whatnot. But I got bored halfway through, and I had to go to other things and come back to it. It's not poorly written necessarily. In spots, it is, but it feels like a 200-page Atlantic article, and I can handle about 6,000 words of that. I don't want 200 pages. And they also, even at one point, slip into meme language. When they give the thesis of the book, they say, this book is dedicated to a simple idea. To have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. That's it. That's the thesis. Well, yeah, because on Twitter you write, that's it. That's the tweet. And then just the few points that they try to introduce some kind of style, I didn't think it worked at all. So that was deeply unfortunate. And the other thing I would say, I didn't feel like, aside from a few things, the book taught me anything. Maybe that's a little conceited, but I didn't get a lot out of it. So I didn't love the reading experience, and I didn't learn very much from it. That being said, I think it is probably useful to a lot of people. I think, and even though I'm ripping on the writing, it's so short and it is a speedy read. It's not like you're stuck with it for that long. But I think for people on the right, even though it's directed to people on the left, I think people on the right would find it useful for the points that it's not true everything government has done everywhere for all time has been universally bad. And even in some areas, maybe there's a reason for it to do more. And then on the left, where it's directed, I think it would be useful for the points. I'm not going to repeat myself, but for the points that I've made. Now, it's also for those reasons that there's been a weird reaction to this book. People on the left are saying, especially the further left you go, they're saying, look, the problem is neoliberalism, and you're just saying we should have more neoliberalism. You don't get it. And then people on the right are saying, you're finally starting to get it. You're not all the way there. There's still some issues with this book. You're still progressive. Nobody's perfect. But you're starting to understand it. And I'm sure people on the left seeing that reaction feel very validated in their views. So it's been a neat thing to watch from that angle. For me, obviously, given my politics, I'm more with the people on the right than on the left. But there are a few lines that made me chuckle, maybe out of, because it's easier than crying, more than anything. But they write, in our political topologies, it is liberals who embrace change and conservatives who cling to stasis. But that is not how things work when you compare red state and blue state housing policies. Or later they write, the big government, small government divide is often more a matter of sentiment than substance. Well, okay, yeah, us libertarians have been saying that for decades. So yeah, you laugh and you roll your eyes when you get to passages like that. So I don't really think the book matches or lives up to the whatever hype it has right now. But it has some virtues, I suppose. So if it interests you, you're not in for a thrilling reading experience, but given the speed with which you can put it down, I think it's probably a worthwhile reading experience. If you're totally glued into this stuff all the time, you know quite a bit about, housing policy, a lot about regulations and stuff like that. I don't know how much you'll get out of it. Maybe read some reviews of the book and see what you think from there. So those were the first two things I finished, and there's a third one here. You'll also notice that those first two books weren't on my TBR the other week, to which I say, in the great words from Dodgeball, cram it up your cram hole. This, however, was on my TBR, and this is Brian Doherty, Modern Libertarianism. This was very much as I expected, which is a primer on libertarianism. So if you're not feeling the 500-600 pages of his big book, Radicals for Capitalism, but you still want to read something about libertarianism, get more of a foot in the door, this is a really good way to go, I think. And I think it's useful for the reasons that the bigger book is useful. So often with ideologies that aren't our own, we reduce it to types of people, personalities, and things like that, and we don't appreciate the different attitudes, approaches, lines of thinking, even epistemologies that can all exist under one political philosophy. We see the complexities in our own, of course, and we don't, or we do get frustrated when others can't see what we see, but very often we're not as good about doing that with other political philosophies. So I think going over this would be helpful to that end. It was still a little bit of a depressing read, and he couldn't even muster that much enthusiasm in the conclusion. looking at recent history and going forward, the first sentence of the last paragraph is, but none of the thinkers or institutions that have helped shaped or constituted the American libertarian movement over the past century promised a quick victory. Not exactly something you would say if you felt like libertarianism was doing well. So, again, a little sad, but an easy little read and a nice little read. So, we'll see. I'm still very much feeling like going back down that rabbit hole, reading Palmer's Realizing Freedom, maybe going back, reading a little Nozick, a little Rand, a little Rothbard, some of those people, Friedman, Hayek. I go back to them frequently, just to passages and stuff, and every now and then I'll reread a whole book. But really digging into it, I'm so tempted. I am so tempted. I missed that material more than I realized until I read both those books by Doherty. And I think it's so much fun and it's so formative for me. So we shall see. Pressing on here, I did start, when I got bored with the Klein and Thompson book, I did start The Second World Wars by Victor Davis Hanson. As I mentioned before, wars plural, because, how can we say that this global conflict was one unified war, or at what point did it become a unified war? Now, he mentions this in the beginning. I think it's just really in the introduction of the book, and pretty much drops it. He doesn't stick with the theme, which is interesting. But either way, I think the main benefit of this book is in the way it's structured, honestly. So he structures it part one, ideas, and there's a few chapters there. Part two, air, then water, earth, fire, people, and then finally 7 ends. And each one has a few chapters in it. And I think that's really useful for people who are new to World War II. When I was making my TBR, I said, I remember this book as being excellent on capturing the phases and transitions of the war in the Atlantic. That's also true. I just got to that part, actually. That's also true of the air war, but I think it's especially true there. If you have a history of World War II that's going chronological, as many of them do, you're going to be jumping in and out of the war of the Atlantic, and maybe that's going to make it hard to trace. Some will, in knowing that, give it a chapter, but it's very common to do that jumping in and out. I think this kind of structure is extremely useful to that end. Also, he hits home on some important themes. So, like changes in production and technology in 39 versus 45. So at the beginning of the war, how do the Germans and the Russians and the Italians and the Russians were on different sides, obviously, at different points of the war, and the Japanese, how did their armies in their size and preparedness and state of technology compared to the Allies? Okay, now what was it like in 42? Okay, now what was it like in 45? The imbalance from the beginning to the end of the war is hilarious, and he captures those changes really, really nicely, and that's especially true when you take it by, the war in the air. You'll really get a good sense of the change in radar technology, right? Going from early fighter planes to later fighter planes, the B-29, that program, the Germans' inability to, create a 4-engine bomber, stuff like that is really terrific and, again, useful. And I'm gonna keep hanging on that word, useful. But there's also other big themes like cooperation and coordination between allies, and the lack of cooperation and coordination between the Axis powers, and how that relates largely, not entirely, to their types of government. Okay, that's really interesting. And there's others too. I think those kinds of things are what the book is best at. But I can't go much further than that. Maybe I'll have new feelings when I finish the book, actually. How much did I read yesterday? 135 pages, probably closer to 100 pages, because I just dipped my toe in it when I needed a break from the Klein book. Now, the book's writing is very flat. I have to say, it's very flat. It is not inspired. Sometimes it feels quite lazy, I'll be honest. So this is a good, useful, serviceable history of World War II. It is not a scintillating one. It is not among the best at all, I would say. So I don't think I'm ranking it as highly on this read through as I did my first read through. Also, when I did that TBR, I mentioned how Victoria Davis Hanson went Trump, and I was going to keep an eye out for stuff, and I still am. When I was very cynical at points in the book, I think I read it in where it wasn't. So at this point, what I would say is he should just know better. That's where I'm at right now. He should just know better. But anyway, another book that I started this weekend, I made a good dent in, isn't out yet, so I won't say too much about it, but I'm 160 pages in. This is Capitalism and Its Critics by John Cassidy, who wrote How Markets Fail. And I don't really know what to think of it so far. He just goes from figure to figure, or critic to critic to critic, and he blends them all together really nicely. Frankly, the Engels and Marx chapter should have been one. The chapter on Engels started about him, and then halfway through, it felt like it was more about Marx than anybody. And then you went into the chapter about Marx. But he blends them all really nicely. It just feels like notes. It feels like a cleaned up collection of notes on figures that maybe he referred back to. And I'm waiting for the book to do more, and it just isn't. There are interesting things to look at, but it's mostly insider baseball that I don't think would interest most people. You can see where he's smoothing things over, the kind of criticisms he decides to mention of people, where he's trying to resuscitate things, what he's downplaying, so on and so forth. Who he's citing, who he's relying on. That's been a neat game, right? You're resuscitating parts of Marx by citing, Anwar Sheikh, who's, a brilliant in many ways, but totally crackpot and obscure heterodox economist right now. So even in his sources, I'm like, I don't know how far that's going to go. Anyway, my biggest irritation has been with definitions. So this is really all I'll get into as far as the book goes here, because again, I don't want to be unfair. But in the introduction, he says, okay, finally, let's talk about terminology and sourcing. He writes that the word capital has been in use for hundreds of years to describe various forms of money and wealth. The term capitalism emerged only in the middle of the 19th century when it was used pejoratively. In 1850, the French socialist leader Louis Blanc described capitalism as the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others. Eventually, the term applied to any market-based economic system in which the means of production were owned by private proprietors, who hired managers and workers. Debates continued about when capitalism itself, rather than the moniker applied to it, came into existence. I follow the lead of German historian Jürgen Kacke, the author of an invaluable short history of capitalism, in treating merchant capitalism, plantation capitalism, and industrial capitalism as variants of the same genus. Okay, now first of all, I'm not going to get into it here, but he already causes himself problems at one point in the book in taking that approach. But what you want to notice there is he didn't actually tell us what definition of capitalism he takes. He mentions two, and then he says these three types of capitalism we take it as being part of, or as being variants of the same genus. Okay, that's not a definition. And then we get to the chapter on Adam Smith, and he writes, histories of capitalism that focus exclusively on the rise of the factory system in Britain and other Western countries tend to overlook this fact. While plantation agriculture wasn't directly comparable to industrial capitalism, which relied on a combination of wage labor and labor-saving machinery, it involved the large-scale production of marketable commodities for profit, and therefore, according to the definition that I gave in the introduction, it was a form of capitalism and an innately global one at that. You mentioned two definitions of capitalism, but it didn't seem like those were ones you agreed with. It looks like you were just saying, here's two different views. And then you went on to argue, or say, rather than even argue, I'm taking these as being, all types of capitalism. That's not a definition. So I find that really irritating. Definitions are something that you need to do in the beginning of your book. You need to be clear and explicit about it. It's a very simple thing, and it's just not there. So I'm annoyed, and I'll be keeping an eye out for whether or not that problem continues. But I don't think it's going to be too worth, it wouldn't be worth spending a ton of time on in a review. Rather, what's more interesting is whether or not taking those three types of capitalism as being part of the same genus actually makes sense. he's already shown that it's kind of incoherent with the way he's approaching it in one part of the book. So that's something I'm going to narrow in a little bit more on. Because I'm not going to, refute Marx or argue about Veblen in a review. What's really interesting with books like this, or what's worth reviewing, is how are you pulling these all together, all these discordant thinkers? Sure, they're all on the, well, most of them are on the left. Obviously, Adam Smith isn't. And they're critics of capitalism, but they're very, very different in many different ways, and they don't have overlapping worldviews at all. So what are we doing here? That's what's interesting. So I was reading that, and I will continue. Now, actually, I'm sorry, I should have done this a moment ago. I have to move off my TBR, How the War Was Won, going back to World War II, and I am moving on to it, Scorched Earth, A Global History of World War II, because this comes out May 6th, excuse me. So it has to get moved. I wouldn't have time to do both of them. I should have predicted that this would happen, given that it's an anniversary year for the war, excuse me. I have to wrap this up, clearly. I just sort of anticipated this would happen in the autumn as we got closer to Christmas rather than in the spring. Either way, I will be reading that in its place as soon as I finish Hanson's book. And then, I feel like I'm missing a book. Either way, the last book we'll end with here is Scarborough's Family. I am doing this read-along to Anthony Trollope, and I'm loving it. I'm moving at the pace of the read-along, which is frustrating in a way, but also deeply enjoyable. And I've only read 4 or 5 Trollope novels. One I've read twice. And I always feel bad for the book that comes after him, or the novel anyway that comes after him, because it's never as good. He's just too enjoyable, and he's too adept. I mean, he puts so many balls in the air and keeps complete control of them. So, or near complete control anyway, of them. So it's a fun thing to watch, and you feel bad for whoever has to follow that act. So that is also what I'm reading. Okay, I think that's probably enough for now. We're going into the tough part of my week. Tuesday, Wednesday is always the slog. I'm gone morning to night, but I won't complain too much about that. It's of my own doing. And then we'll swing back into Thursday, and hopefully I can come back with more videos. I was hoping to compensate after not having many videos last weekend, but I just didn't. I just never felt quite right. So here's hoping to having good workouts this week, full recovery, and then into a full set of videos next week. All right, we'll leave it there. Again, thanks, BookTube.